Howdy y'all, welcome back. Thank you for joining me again today. To unravel the threads of the historical narrative, we must first try to understand the mystery that's hidden between the lines. For who pulls more of the proverbial strings of industry than the manufacturers? And what is a more profitable product to sell than war? Today, we will examine in great detail the history of the Krupp family, a 400-year-old German dynasty that played a crucial role in a multitude of different key events over the last 4 centuries. Again, as this is the current narrative, take everything that we discussed today with a grain of salt, but I will attempt to elaborate on some of the more glaring details within this historical narrative. The Krupp family record begins in roughly 1587, when progenitor and known merchant Arndt Krupp was said to have arrived in Essen. He was welcomed into the Merchants Guild of Essen. However, within weeks of his arrival, an epidemic of plague broke out in the city. Krupp was then said to have made his fortune by purchasing the properties of those who passed or fled the city, and he became one of the wealthiest men in the region. Interesting. Arndt Krupp himself passed away in 1624, leaving his business and inherited buildings to his son, Anton. One of the buildings Anton inherited or invested in was a blacksmith's forge, which the Krupp family utilized to produce arms during the 30 Years' War. This is the first instance of the Krupp family's long history in arms. We're told the Krupps continued their practice of purchasing buildings for very low prices and inheriting whatever businesses were contained within. And by the mid-18th century, the Krupps were not only one of the richest families in Essen, but also one of its largest private landowners. Now again, keep this little tidbit in mind, but in 1751, the Krupp family business was run by Arndt's great-great-grandson, Friedrich Jodocus Krupp, who then married Helene Ascherfeld. The issue being, Helene Ascherfeld was also Arndt Krupp's great-great-granddaughter, and apparently the Krupps followed a common practice of certain feudal and merchant families of the time, keeping it in the bloodline. Now, Jodocus Krupp passed away just 6 years after his marriage, and much debate then arose in the family as Helene was left to run the Krupp family dynasty, the first time a woman had been put in charge of the Krupp merchant house. While the biography on her is slim pickings, we are told Helene purchased or inherited dozens of more properties, including wool mills, coal mills, and a strategic iron forge in Essen that would prove instrumental in reshaping German history. Helene continued to run the family business for over 50 years, snatching up as many properties as she could, and catapulting the Krupp family to one of the wealthiest families in all German-speaking lands. In 1807, Helene named her grandson, Friedrich Krupp, as manager of the iron forge in Essen. Again, here's another little hiccup in the narrative possibly worth a little further digging, but we're told by 1809, Friedrich had ran the iron forge into the ground, possibly chasing after the chemical equation for creating cast steel. Not to get too deep into that, as we will save it for another video, but essentially, a watchmaker from England named Benjamin Huntsman pioneered the process for creating cast steel the whole way back in 1740. However, the British Crown heavily guarded this secret recipe to create cast steel, and they used this advantage in their process of trying to capture as many territories as possible in the 18th century. By the time of Napoleon, 60 years later, the process to create cast steel had still not been perfected outside of Britain, and Napoleon offered a handsome sum to anyone who was able to unlock the secret and recreate the process. We're told Friedrich Krupp attempted for years to achieve this goal. Once Helene passed away in 1810 and Friedrich was made sole owner of the Krupp merchant house, he spent the entire family fortune in the hunt to create cast steel. He founded his cast steel works in 1811. He had a son, Alfred, in 1812, and miraculously, independent of British influence, he successfully discovered the process to cast steel in 1816. Friedrich also coveted this knowledge, however, and upon his passing in 1826, he was said to have, while confined to his bed, taught the process to his 14-year-old son, Alfred. Again, seemingly indicating the cyclical nature of this history, as well as the numerous coincidences, we're told Friedrich had spent the last years of his life trying to cast the largest steel ingot he could, in hopes of impressing a king or queen and officially entering into business with a crown. Alfred soon also became obsessed with creating the largest steel ingot possible, an endeavor that nearly bankrupted the Krupp family. Yet Alfred's true breakthrough came when he invented and patented the spoon roller, which made punching or piercing steel pieces from a larger sheet possible. By 1847, Alfred had made the first cannon entirely out of cast steel. This invention awarded him a place at the world's first fair, the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, where Alfred showcased a flawless steel ingot of over 4,000 pounds, over twice as large as the next heaviest steel ever cast. This steel creation caused an uproar, and Krupp was invited to the next great World's Fair, the Paris Exposition of 1855. We're told, to the shock and awe of nearly everyone in attendance, including the crowned kings and queens of the world, Alfred Krupp unveiled a pure cast steel ingot he created that weighed over 100,000 pounds. However, the primary mode of income for Alfred and the Krupp merchant family came from the United States of America, who purchased tens of thousands of no-weld railway tires from the company. The United States railway system is often said to have been so efficient in part because of Krupp Steel. Yet just like his ancestors before him, Alfred too sought to pioneer other fields. In particular, Alfred found breech-loading cannons to be far superior to muzzle-loading cannons, i.e., he found cannons you could load in the back of the cannon without repositioning to be much more efficient than cannons you had to load in the front. Thus, Krupp devised blueprints to create a 100% cast steel breech-loading cannon, which he did by the end of the 1850s. Initially, the Kingdom of Prussia refused to utilize such creations on the battlefield. However, when Wilhelm became King of Prussia in 1859, Krupp Steel was quickly adopted, and by 1860, Krupp was the official arms manufacturer of Prussia. Krupp Steel masterpieces were used to easily defeat Austria and France in the German Wars of Unification, as those countries both still used bronze weaponry. By the end of the 19th century, Krupp had manufactured steel arms for countries all across our realm, from Russia to Chile to Thailand. We're told during the financial panic of 1873, Alfred Krupp spent the entire Krupp merchant family fortune buying as many mines and tunnels as he could, as well as investing in Dutch shipping companies. He received a bailout from the Prussian government. By 1878, Alfred Krupp had created the largest proving ground or military testing site in the world, known as Meppen. Here, Krupp invited the heads of state from every major nation and kingdom and displayed the power of his steel inventions. From 1878 through 1879, over 46 new countries employed Krupp to manufacture their arms. At the time of his passing in 1887, Alfred Krupp had created a total of 24,576 arms, with exactly 10,666 of them being for Germany, and the rest being exported to other nations at an incredible profit. Alfred Krupp was also said to have been one of the first in modern times to develop entire cities from scratch just for his employees, and he is often cited as one of the first major employers to pioneer completely taking care of the employee. For example, bathhouses were provided and employees received free medical services. Accident, life, and sickness insurance societies were formed by Krupp, and Krupp contributed to their support. Technical and manual training schools were provided for all employees. Here is where we start to stray into the bit of the old adage, more money, more problems. With the passing of Alfred, his only son, Friedrich Alfred, took control of the company. I'll refer to him moving forward as F.A. F.A. was an outgoing man, yet rather eccentric in his beliefs. F.A. was a close friend of the king, Wilhelm II, and under F.A., the Krupp merchant family expanded their business even more, creating the first diesel engines for Rudolf Diesel, and by 1896, they controlled the Germania shipyard, which not only was Germany's main warship builder, but under Krupp control, the Germania shipyard built Germany's first U-boat or naval submarine in 1906. However, F.A. Krupp seemed to have certain proclivities which consumed him and nearly bankrupted the company. In 1902, Friedrich Alfred was discovered on his private island in Italy, where he was found spending private time with 40 to 50 boys who weren't quite old enough to be there. He was subsequently arrested and mysteriously found without life in his jail cell the next morning. His wife was nearly immediately institutionalized, and the Krupp company was teetering on the brink of catastrophic failure. And yet, don't merchants always seem to have the best luck? In 1903, the Krupp merchant family formally incorporated as a joint stock company. However, it was being run by Bertha Krupp, the teenage daughter of F.A. Kaiser Wilhelm II was said to have greatly disliked the idea of women in power, possibly alluding to the nature of his relationship with F.A. before his passing. But I digress. Either way, Kaiser Wilhelm ordered that Bertha Krupp marry Gustav von Bohlen, who not only was a Prussian ambassador to the Vatican, but was also the son of the great Prussian general Henry Bohlen, who had led troops in 3 major wars: the Mexican-American War, the Crimean War, and the American Civil War, all as a hired hand. Gustav then adopted the Krupp surname. By this time, Gustav had begun to manufacture barbed wire, and Krupp was also the first major manufacturer of stainless steel. But the real breakthrough came with the outbreak of World War I. Not only was Krupp the leading manufacturer of arms in Germany during this time period, but Krupp actually used conscripted labor throughout the war, making for even larger profits. By the end of World War I, Krupp had produced more than 80 U-boats alone, as well as a massive freighter to haul the submarines worldwide. Following World War I, Krupp was reduced to manufacturing other key components of everyday life, and while many assumed the company would go under, Gustav Krupp changed the company slogan to "We make everything," and began producing a multitude of different products, big and small, up to and including rail cars. By 1924, the Raw Steel Association was established in Luxembourg as a quota-fixing cartel for coal and steel, and this was founded by France, Britain, Belgium, Luxembourg, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. However, Germany chose to violate the quotas that were established and pay fines in order to monopolize Krupp's output. Gustav Krupp and the Krupp Family Merchant Dynasty initially were skeptical of the changes happening in Germany leading up to World War II, but by the end of the war, the Krupps were indicted as some of the war's greatest criminals. However, remarkably, at the Nuremberg trials, Gustav Krupp was ruled too senile to stand trial. His eldest son, Alfred, had entered the family business in 1943. Alfred's godfather was the king, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Alfred studied engineering in Munich, practiced photographing old architecture in his spare time, and was an Olympic-level sailor. Just like others before him, Alfred was given sole ownership of the Krupp family and businesses by a government order. In this instance, it was known as the Lex Krupp. Because of this order, and due to his close ties to the crown, Alfred Krupp inherited a number of important businesses during World War II, including Arthur Krupp Steel in Austria, the Corporation for Mechanical Construction in Germany, the Rothschilds tractor factories in France, the Skoda industrial conglomerate in Czechoslovakia, and nearly all the major shipyards in Germany. This activity became known as plundering after the war. However, another key facet tucked into this narrative is the forced labor that was used during the war. These numbers are quite revealing. We're told Krupp averaged about 380,000 workers during World War II. However, at its peak, over 1/4 of these workers were slave labor, or about 100,000 people. Given the nature of the war itself, it then becomes rather interesting to note that only about 15,000 to 20,000 of these 100,000 laborers were of a Jewish background. Just food for thought. By 1942, Krupp had taken over nearly all steel factories in Western Russia. Following the Battle of Stalingrad, Krupp predicted that Germany would actually lose the war, and he began secretly moving his money overseas, which allowed the Krupp merchant family to keep nearly all of their fortune following the war. In 1948, the Krupp family head, Alfred, was convicted of war crimes and stripped of his possessions, including his factories. Yet by 1951, American forces actually ordered Krupp be given amnesty, and his property was restored to him just a few years later. Seemingly distracting from any backlash that this would cause, America quickly became embroiled in the Korean War, and Krupp disappeared into the relative shadows, slowly re-establishing his merchant house as one of the richest in the world. Alfred ended unprofitable businesses including shipbuilding, railway tires, and farm equipment, instead focusing on selling his former equipment, businesses, land, and industry secrets. He established personal diplomacy with heads of state, making both open and secret deals. Krupp built rolling mills in Mexico, paper mills in Egypt, foundries in Iran, refineries in Greece, a vegetable oil processing plant in Sudan, steel plants throughout Brazil, and he rebuilt an entire town in India for his employees. Krupp began creating atomic reactors in the 1950s, and by 1959, Krupp was the fourth largest company in Europe with over 125,000 employees. Alfred Krupp rigged the industry so that all his sequestered businesses were bought back by him for a fraction of the cost, mostly using a shell company that he set up in Sweden. The European common market oddly supported these moves. and by 1960, Krupp was the richest man in Europe and one of the world's handful of billionaires. Before I wrap up, something I thought really stood out and why I mentioned earlier the percentage of workers that were indentured under Krupp. As I mentioned, a total of roughly 100,000 workers were enslaved, with about 20,000 or 20% of them being Jewish. Krupp, following backlash post-war, released a statement accepting culpability in the events of World War II, and he set up a fund to provide compensation to the forced Jewish laborers. Yet to this day, Krupp denies any wrongdoing or to provide compensation for the other 80,000 enslaved people forced to work in Krupp factories during the war. However, the facade created by Krupp was seen through by the end of the 1960s, and harsher scrutiny was placed upon the Krupp business, which revealed a need for a complete governmental overhaul. Alfred reorganized much of the Krupp company as a corporation and foundation for scientific research. Alfred had only one son, who renounced the Krupp name, and while his son was married twice, he was also believed to have the same proclivities as some of the other Krupp ancestors, and never had children. Alfred Krupp passed away in 1967, with the company's transformation finalized in the days following his passing. Alfred's only son, as I mentioned, who renounced the name, had developed many diseases by his 30s and passed away in 1986 from complications of cancer. With that, the 400-year legacy of the Krupp merchant family had come to an end. Among the other achievements the Krupp merchant family founded in their long history, Krupp developed the first anti-aircraft weapons, anti-balloon cannons, which helped Prussia achieve countless victories over the French. According to the narrative, of all places, the United States of America was the first to officially employ balloons in warfare, with the U.S. Army using them to surveil the Confederacy. In return, the Confederates developed their own dirigibles to monitor the North. However, by the Franco-Prussian War, half a decade later, France was the first country to heavily employ the use of balloons and dirigibles in Europe. With the siege of Paris and communication lines broken down, the French sent out a fleet of balloons in hopes of reaching their allies. However, Krupp created a modified 1-pound cannon, mounting it on a horse-drawn carriage frame, creating the world's first anti-aircraft weaponry, known as the balloon defense cannon. Krupp also fortified the batteries of Germany by 1871 to be able to reach ships over 2 miles away, making inhabiting German lands by foreign troops nearly impossible. The crowning achievement of Krupp's genius, however, may be seen in the Paris siege cannon. While only employed for a few months during World War I, the siege cannon, also called the Kaiser Wilhelm, had a maximum firing range of 81 miles. With a mass over 256 tons or 512,000 pounds and a total length over 111 feet, the Paris siege cannon effectively shelled Paris in 1918 from a distance of 75 miles. The Parisians believed that they had actually been attacked by a high-altitude Zeppelin and were completely dumbfounded as the 234-pound shells rained down. The Paris cannon not only could reach a distance of 81 miles away, but the projectile itself would reach a maximum altitude of over 26 miles, the greatest height ever achieved by a human-made projectile until the first successful flight of a V-2 rocket in 1942. Impacting at a speed of 3,669 miles per hour, The cannon reached Paris 75 miles away in 182 seconds. Because Krupp and the Germans did not want the Allies to inherit this technology, nearing the end of World War I, all Paris cannons and their blueprints were destroyed by Germany, of which 7 were known to exist, making the full understanding of this technology nearly impossible. Looking back even further into Krupp history, we are told Krupp was responsible for constructing the Great Venezuela Railway in 1888, which stretched 111 miles from Caracas to Valencia. The Great Venezuela was the longest railroad in Venezuela's history and used cutting-edge new techniques financed by Krupp to traverse Venezuela's mountainous terrain. This included 212 Krupp Steel viaducts and over 80 tunnels that were created using Krupp Steel equipment. The Great Venezuela Railroad was said to have led directly to the Venezuela crisis of 1902 and 1903 as Krupp looked to recoup money owed for his investment. This masterpiece of engineering somehow only operated for about 70 years before the last train ran on the dilapidated tracks in 1966. During the Balkan Wars, which saw the Ottoman territory in Europe greatly reduced, Krupp had been the main supplier of arms to both Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and the Turkish market was considered to be Krupp's largest outside of Germany. Krupp also provided a majority of the arms for Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and also had a large market in Austria-Hungary. The history truly has so many facets, however, that just looking at the siege cannons made by Krupp, we also have the battery Palmern, which was the largest siege weapon by size and by shell ever created up until 1917. Protected completely by armor, the battery Palmern was mounted on a steel bridge having a pivot in the front. The rear part traveled along a circular rail track in a concrete pit of about 70 feet in diameter. This was controlled completely through the use of electric motors. The entire structure appeared as if it was underground, as it was surrounded on all sides by concrete shelters, as well as dummy cannons that were placed on top to confuse enemies. The battery Palmern fired shells which weighed 1,600 pounds, and it was successfully used to siege Dunkirk, about 31 miles away. However, by the 1930s, the sheer audacity of these inventions had reached unprecedented levels. Krupp developed 2 railway cannons by 1933, the Gustav and the Dora, which used shells weighing roughly 15,000 pounds that could reach distances 23 miles away. Further showcasing the ingenuity of the Krupp engineering process, Krupp also developed tanks as well as the most famous anti-tank cannon of all time, known as the German 88. Originally conceived as an anti-aircraft cannon, the German 88, also called the 8.8 centimeter flak, could be transported on wheels and assembled in just over 2 minutes. With a maximum firing range of over 32,000 feet, the German 88 was considered the most feared element of the war. Quoting Paul Fussell in 1989, and I quote, "American troops knew that the greatest single weapon of the war was the German 88mm flat trajectory cannon, which brought down thousands of bombers and tens of thousands of soldiers. The Allies had nothing as good, despite one of them designating itself the world's greatest industrial power." End quote. Throughout World War II, Germany constructed multiple full-scale Krupp decoy sites, entire factories that were completely empty on the inside, but were made to appear as other Krupp plants from a bird's eye view. When Krupp pivoted their role following the war, they became one of the largest truck manufacturers in the entire world. And by the 1960s, Krupp also pioneered the pressure chambers of underwater diving vessels, leading to the exploration of the deepest known parts of the ocean for the first time in history. Krupp was also responsible for the cap to the Chrysler Building in Manhattan. In the year 1967, an economic recession resulted in significant financial losses for the Krupp business. In 1992, the company went public for the first time, which then culminated in a merger with Thyssen AG in 1999 to form the industrial conglomerate known today as Thyssen Krupp AG.